Welcome to Blackbird episode number 18. My name is James, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Corey DeVos of Integral Life. Corey is a proponent of integral theory, which you will remember from the episode with Bryan O'Doherty, and I would recommend going back and listening to that episode with Bryan, either before or after this interview, and I'll make sure to put a link to it in the podcast show notes. Additionally, I'll put some notes and maybe an infographic or something that you can follow along with, because if you'll recall, integral can be a little bit complicated, especially to new folks to it. It's definitely a subject that I'm interested in right now, so I will probably be featuring other integral practitioners, theorists, commentators, etc. on the show, so buckle up for that. And again, if you like it, if you don't like it, if you have problems or arguments, questions, etc., then please feel free to email them to me. You can email me at blackbird@substack.com. Also, you can DM me on Twitter at JamesLJ. All right, and with all that being said, here is my interview with Corey DeVos. All right, Corey, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So your name came up after my interview with Bryan O'Doherty as sort of an authority in the integral space. You're kind of a leader. You run a website or a couple, and you're an integral artist, which I'd love to get into. But first, why don't you go ahead and just kind of introduce yourself so that the audience knows who we're hearing from?
Yeah, sure. So, my name is Corey DeVos. I am the editor-in-chief of integrallife.com. Which is an organization that was founded by Ken Wilber, who is sort of a head honcho in integral land. He's sort of the most well-known integral philosopher out there. And a lot of the work that we do is based on his work, his integral framework. I've been working with Ken and with the organization for the last, 18 years. I got involved way back in 2003, which is when we first launched our very first website, which was called Integral Naked back then, because we had this sort of adolescent sense of humor at the time. And then that matured into our current organization, which is called Integral Life. And yeah, this has been basically where I've spent the vast majority of my adult life here in Integral Land, trying to create platforms and resources for people who are just getting into this material for the first time, as well as for the people who've been here for a while and are really trying to find ways to, put more meat on the bones and flourish as much as they can within sort of the integral territory.
Awesome. Thanks. So I don't want to rehash what Bryan and I went over too much. We went all the way up through the colors, but I would love to know from you, like, what you think, as just sort of a review, what are like the most important concepts from integral theory that the audience should remember?
Yeah, well, we kind of have a few different heuristics for this, a couple different sort of shorthand phrases that we use. One of which was a little more geeky, is quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. Those being sort of the main 5 elements of integral theory. And those are some fairly heavy lifting words. We can sort of, get into each of those if you want to. But I think a more sort of a simpler shorthand, at least in terms of how integral lands in terms of our personal development, our ongoing sort of health and happiness and fulfillment and so forth. We use another shorthand, which is called wake up, grow up, clean up, show up.
Oh, good.
And these are basically...
That was one of my questions. So I'm glad we're covering it already. Good.
Sweet. Yeah. So, the basic idea being that each of these 4 sort of buckets, these kind of categories, are different methods of actually maturing as human beings. So growing up refers to, moving through these stages of development, which I believe you just said you talked to Bryan about in your last interview. Mm-hmm. Waking up is actually sort of awakening to multiple states of consciousness that are available to us, which can be anything from sort of emotional states all the way up to the spiritual states that are described in a lot of the world's spiritual traditions. Cleaning up refers to the idea of shadow work. So the idea that we have sort of these unknown sort of subjects within us that have been sort of split off from the rest of us, either through trauma or various challenges that we might experience through life. One of the ways that we cope with those challenges is actually to kind of split off these pieces of ourself. And the path of cleaning up is about reclaiming them. So sort of identifying, oh, okay, this is why I get so triggered in this particular kind of situation, and why, I can just all of a sudden be acting like a complete asshole, right? And then the state kind of passes and I'm like, oh, why was I such an asshole back then? Well, chances are something got activated in you that needs to be sort of reintegrated into the rest of your self system. And then the final leg is called showing up, which is basically, look, we're doing all of this inner work. You know what I mean? We're doing all this work to grow up and to wake up and to clean up. Showing up is where this inner work, I think, kind of sort of spills out into the rest of the world. So this is where all of the fruits of that work begin to, land in your relationships, your career, your work in the world, your behaviors, your life decisions, so forth and so on. So that's sort of the thing I like about Integral, is it really, really does sort of invite all of you to play.
It seems like that the wake up, grow up, clean up, show up model is also kind of holarchic. Like, you can't really grow up until you've woken up, and you can't really clean up until you've grown up, and you definitely can't show up until you've done that shadow work, but it's also ongoing. Is that right?
Yeah, they all hang together, I would say. I mean, I think that there's Ken often talks about some of the evidence out there saying how, for example, if you're doing work with waking up, which often involves things like contemplative practice and meditation and mindfulness and things like that, there's apparently a lot of evidence that those practices can actually accelerate our growing up process. Now, I don't think we know whether or not the reverse is also true, whether or not people who are more grown up have an easier time waking up. I suspect that's true, but I'm not sure we have any, hard evidence about that. But I think what's going on here is, at the very, very core of all four of these really is a very, very simple sort of mechanic of transformation. And that's something that, Robert Keegan describes as subject becoming object. So we start to develop this capacity to look at ourselves, to make some piece of our subjective experience into an object of awareness. And this is actually the main mechanism behind all four of those. So when you're doing growing up work, typically what you're doing is you're looking at your own stage of development sort of as an object. And when you look at it as an object, that creates an opportunity or a space for a new kind of subject to sort of come online, right? And hopefully that new subject is coming from an incrementally higher perspective than the sort of view that you're looking at as an object in your awareness. Same thing with waking up. What we're doing with the waking up process is we are bringing awareness to, making object out of these multiple states of consciousness that we're always in. So that's like, on a very simple level, that's like the difference between being angry versus sort of being mindful of your anger, right? Whenever we get into sort of really, really tense, sort of hyper aroused states, we tend to lose ourselves in those states. We lose the capacity to sort of see it clearly, and to therefore kind of see through it and see ourselves clearly. And then the same thing for cleaning up. Cleaning up is also a process of making these subjects into objects, but then taking that object of awareness and reintegrating it into your subject. So it's sort of fascinating that all of these different paths are using the same basic mechanic, right, of turning subject into object, but it's sort of applying them in different, let's just say different sort of vectors in our development. We can think of growing up as sort of a vertical, give it a vertical metaphor for it. We're kind of climbing a ladder in a certain kind of way. Whereas, waking up, we might look as a horizontal development. So we can have access to these multiple states of experience, for example, no matter where we are in our developmental capacity. So, you can be at a pre-modern sort of brutish earlier stage of development and you're going to feel anger and you're going to express that anger in a particular way, versus someone who's at a, a later stage, let's say a postmodern stage, also feels a state of anger, but they're going to interpret and express that anger in their own way. So how we wield these states of consciousness is going to change as we sort of develop up and down the growth hierarchies. But, those states are always there. I think that's the basic understanding. The states are always there. You always have access to them.
I think it's a lot easier for me, at least, as a not very introspective person, to view the different colors. Are the colors, is that the same as the levels? Or is that okay? Yep. So well, and that gets me into another thing that I actually brought up with Bryan, that he didn't push back against, but I have come to realize that actually what I think about the levels might be different from what Ken and maybe you think about it too. So I'd like to ask you about that in a second, but let me try to keep my thoughts collected. And now I don't even remember what I was going to say. So let's get it. I know. Let's get into levels. So, I know what it is. I was, as a not very introspective person, it's really easy for me to view like society as a certain level, or wonder why, for instance, all these green people all of a sudden want us to trust science, which when they're talking about science, they're talking more about and I'm speaking specifically of the pandemic, of course, because that's all anybody's thinking about right now. They want us to trust science, which is more of an orange thing. But when they're talking about science, they're really more talking about like predictive models, not like experimental scientific method science. And to me, predictive model just sounds a lot like prophecy when you put it in that context anyway. Which is more of a blue thing. What is it? What is that's happening there that I'm perceiving anyway? Where it seems like the green person is using an orange concept to express like a blue demand, I guess.
Yeah. Well, this happens all the time. And I think part of it is, it's symptomatic of the fact that the story of development is not one that has fully saturated our culture. I think that generally speaking, our culture relates to development as something that sort of happens, during your school years, throughout adolescence, maybe continues into college. But like once you become a grown up, you're a grown up now. And we don't really have this understanding that like, no, this is a process that, if you engage with it, will take you through, the rest of your lifetime, right? There's always going to be sort of a greater whole or another higher level that you can aspire to, right? And it's always going to be there. So without this story of development, which is something that Integral really brings into the picture in a very, I think, cogent and coherent way. When we don't have that story of development, then basically it's like, especially in this postmodern age of Facebook and things like that, everything just kind of gets thrown against the wall, right? Like, for example, in politics land, it's like, here are 1,000 different political strategies, right? Some of them are going to be more effective than others, but some of them are going to be more or less effective for particular stages of development. I mean, I do a lot of talks these days about, what's happening on sort of the liberal side of the woods and all this stuff about cancel culture and things like that. Well, a lot of people tend to think of political progressives as being, sort of green altitude, which is one of the higher, more mature sort of developmental stages. And yet we see them taking these strategies, right, of cancel culture, for example, that are oftentimes associated with more amber kind of rigid, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of a classic pre-modern conservative strategy to deal with ideas and morals that you don't want to deal with. You cancel them, right? You burn the witches, you burn the Beatles albums, right? And you destroy the statues of the Buddha. I mean, this has been sort of, cancel culture has been with us for a very, very long time. What's particularly, I think, disappointing about it is seeing progressives starting to, embrace cancel culture, because it is inherently an anti-progressive, illiberal strategy. Right. So there's just a lot of confusion among people because I think that, they don't actually have the understanding of what is an appropriate strategy in order to meet sort of, the challenges and in order to produce the results that you're looking for. I promise you, progressives, cancel culture is not going to result in a more progressive liberal society. It's going to do the exact opposite. So, I mean, I don't know how much that answers your question, but, it's basically just to say all of this is sort of being handed to us as, this grab bag of different strategies that really come out of different levels. And we haven't until now had a good way to piece all of these things together. And then there's another, I think, component to this too, which is, when someone says something like trust the science, what they're really saying is trust this particular view that I'm going to call science.
Right.
Right. And oftentimes we associate that view as being more or less orange. But the reality is science and spirituality exist at every stage of development. So there's a such thing as red science, as amber science, as, sort of traditional religious science, for example. There's orange science, there's green science. And guess what, guys? There's teal and turquoise, which are sort of the colors that we associate with integral stages of development. There are integral forms of science as well. And in fact, I think those integral forms of science are going to be what helps kind of clean up this mess for everyone else.
When I first joined the Facebook group, what's the name of it? Integral Global. Integral Global. Thank you. I posed the question that libertarians, and I'm trying to not brand this as a libertarian podcast, but that's not working very well. So I'm just gonna say my audience is mostly libertarians. It's a question that libertarians get a lot. What distinguishes integral theory from a cult? You guys have like one kind of major leader. With libertarians, that leader is, for like the uninitiated, it's Ayn Rand. For the initiated, it's Murray Rothbard. And libertarians will appeal to Murray Rothbard's authority as if it's an argument. So I just wanted to pose the question. And just like with libertarians, I got not attacked, but like the top comments were, here, read all of these articles, or did you even bother Googling? That kind of thing. And so I felt right at home, to be honest, because it's exactly
that's what you get. That's what you get for asking nuanced questions on a platform on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. So it's heartening to know that even in integral circles, we do have that same sort of just impulse to jump on someone. And not only, so the more helpful people were like, here, read all these books. And okay, that's fine. But like, I'm also still like on training wheels here. I haven't even, I haven't even gotten all the colors down. I was just using blue instead of amber because I got the spiral dynamics confused with Ken Wilber's model. So, but I guess my kind of question is,
how are we not a cult?
No.
Oh, okay.
You're not a cult. And that's one thing that I have, I've kind of just in the last, month or so, come to realize that they're even in that Integral Global Facebook group, there's lots and lots of disagreement.
Tons.
You've got, and even more so than in the other groups that I kind of inhabit, it was really interesting to me to see posts coming from like a conservative bent, and not even like, what I would consider like, Hillary Clinton, maybe conservative to someone who's way on the left. But this was like Trumpy stuff, which is, interesting to see in a group that is, I would consider Integral inherently progressive because, it's progressing from the postmodern to what's next.
Yep. I like to think of it as post-progressive in a sense. If I can I riff on that just for a second?
Yeah, please do.
Because, this sort of lands for me in terms of, what are my own sort of political identities? And how do I describe them to people? I often describe myself as an integral progressive, but that has a very, I think, particular meaning that might be a little bit different than how we think of progressivism in the world, for example. Because I think that, until you get to integral consciousness, the world is largely a winner take all food fight. It's my ideas or your ideas, right? One of us is right, the other one is wrong. And I think that when we begin to mature at these integral stages, we begin to understand these not as sort of ideological opposites as much as critical polarities that need to be reintegrated. So for me, progressive and conservative, when we take it out of sort of the ideologies of these, political groups, the particular constellation of the GOP and the particular constellation of the DNC, like let's kind of put that stuff aside for a second here and just look at pure political theory, political philosophy. I think most of us at an integral stage of development would agree that an integral politics has to reconcile and integrate the very, very important polarities that exist between something like progressive and conservative. So, for example, when I describe myself as a progressive, my progressivism often includes some awfully conservative sounding solutions, right? Because I know that my progressivism, all progressivism means from this space is I want new systems to replace old systems that aren't working for us anymore and are, maybe a little bit obsolete because Jesus, this world changes really, really quickly. But sometimes those new systems can appear to be conservative. Like, for example, one of my big progressive ideas to sort of create more unity within this nation is to reinstate the draft. Now, I don't want to leave that hanging there. Reinstate the draft, but convert it into a Peace Corps or National Guard-like service where we're taking white kids, black kids, poor kids, rich kids, men, women, and we're bringing them all together in service of something greater than themselves. This to me is an ideal integral solution because you're actually serving both conservatism in the short term. You're actually giving people that sense of healthy nationalism that I think people are really, really craving in this country, right? And has been largely sort of eroded by, multiple decades of globalism and things like that. You're serving that. You're saying we're going to make a space for healthy nationalism and patriotism and this idea that, you are part of something that is much, much larger than yourself. And you can derive all sorts of meaning and purpose from that while bringing us together. And interestingly enough, it creates more progressives in the long run because we know that one of the biggest accelerants of development is simply exposing yourself to people who think differently than you do, right? Just exposing yourself to new perspectives is often enough to give you just a little bit of leverage to sort of, well, again, to make your subject into an object and say, hey, have I, do I really have this right? Or do I have some more, growing up to do here? So this is an example of, I think, what I'm going to call an integrally progressive solution that serves conservatism as much as it serves progressivism. And I think, ideas like that tend to be very, very appealing to integral folks because we're able to, again, sort of integrate these polarities, but leave sort of the ideological crap behind. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Obviously we'll probably quibble on the issues, but
Totally.
I am grasping where you're coming from on that, which I like. It does seem like at least the leadership, the bigger name integral thinkers are by and large kind of in that neoliberal Democratic Party, and not the AOC Bernie Sanders Democratic Party, but like the, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton Democratic Party worldview. And it goes back to the very like beginning of this, where like Bill Clinton was endorsing Wilber's work. There's an integral like education organization. I can't remember the name of it, but their entire like charter is based on the UN. And then, even in your podcast, after the events of January 6th, you took it as a given that an insurrection happened It wasn't given event, how do we interpret this? It's given insurrection, how do we react to this? Which I would take issue with. I don't think that was an insurrection. I think it was largely just a bunch of people who got emotionally worked up and weren't pushed back against by the cops at the Capitol, and so they did what they could. And led by a couple of people who may or may not have been agents provocateur, but I don't want to get into that really. I guess that would be my criticism. My question is, do you think that that's true, and do you think that it's an issue if it is? I guess.
Well, do I think it's true? I mean, yeah, I do think it's largely. I don't want to be sort of totalizing in my responses here, because integral actually is a fairly rich field, and there's a lot of people involved who disagree with each other. But I will say that, a lot of the most significant integral leaders come from the boomer generation, and they often have boomer generation views on things like geopolitics. And I also think there's another factor here, which is, integral is trying to emerge and trying to find more influence and trying to, really find ways to make an impact in the world. However, integral is also emerging in a world that has certain qualities as it is, right? Mm-hmm. So, when Ken's work really began to, hit sort of a critical mass of popularity and people were really getting into it, the structure of the world was as such, right? This was during the Bill Clinton years. There was a lot of talk about this sort of third way politics. We were, about halfway through the neoliberal paradigm, the economic paradigm that was handed to us by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. This was an era where Democrats basically had to, sort of conform themselves to this neoliberal economic reality that they found themselves in. So that's where we started seeing sort of the more corporate Democrats and, and the whole thing. Now, because of course you did. We were only 15, 20 years into the neoliberal project when this was happening. And these things generally come down the line in like 40, 50-year chunks, and you kind of can't change horses midstream. It's very difficult to anyway. So I think Ken, to his credit, was sort of trying to find, inroads where he could. And when he started seeing people, like Bill Clinton, wow, the president of the United States is using my work in some capacity. Mm-hmm. There is an opportunity to expand our influence here. And maybe that influence can grow to the point where we can start, sort of reforming some of these political parties along more integral lines. I can see how that was very, very appealing to Ken during those times. However, if you look at Ken's book, Trump in the Post-Truth World, for example, he is deeply critical of Democrats. In fact, these days, I do this ongoing series of discussions with him, and sometimes I have to okay, Ken, let's lay off the left a little bit. Let's start shitting on the right over here because, well, and they're up to some stuff too. So Ken's, I think, political outlook has largely changed as the realities of our geopolitical situation, it became more and more obvious that this is not sustainable and that this is kind of starting to crash around us. And in fact, Donald Trump is a symptom of that crashing around us. Yeah. And Ken wanted us to pay closer attention, not to what's happening in the aquarium, but rather the water that we're all swimming in to begin with. And I have to say, it's really hard for most people to look at that water. That actually requires a sort of developmental capacity to take a certain number of perspectives in order to see the water that you're swimming in. So all of which is to say, yeah, I think that's true, that when integral was really sort of hitting its cadence, that was at a time when we were in full on sort of neoliberal land, right? And so a lot of the integral political prescriptions reflected those realities. I think that's changing now as people are beginning to ask the question, okay, well, what comes next?
What does truth look like to an integral person? So to the modern age, I guess, or orange, the truth is what you can observe, and to the
Mhm.
green stage, it's like what truth is, like what it means to me,
Mhm.
subjective. Um, where does an integral worldview land on that?
It's an awesome question because it's a fascinating question because it actually, I think, gets to the heart of what integral is and what it's trying to do as an
Yeah,
epistemology. So awesome question. Let me just say that when we first started talking about what is integral and really why integral, I sort of came at this from more of a personal development angle. That's where
yeah,
ideas like wake up, grow up, clean up, show up, that all works great for, sort of my personal experience of integral. But where integral really came from is this understanding that, you know, we live in a very complex, multi-dimensional world. I think it's obvious to anyone who's paying attention, right? Which is why we have all of these different methodologies in order to make sense of our world, ourselves, our universe, and our place in it. So we've got physics and chemistry and systems theory, and we have cultural anthropology and archaeology, and we have relationship therapists and life coaches, and we have spiritual practitioners and religion and psychology and entire schools of philosophy. We have all of these very different methodologies that we use in order to make sense of the world. And here's what happens when you only use one of those methodologies. It's sort of like the old cliche about the elephant, like one guy, a whole bunch of blind men
mhm.
are basically feeling up an elephant, trying to figure out what the hell this thing is. One person's holding onto a tail and he thinks the elephant's a snake. The other one's holding onto a leg and he thinks the elephant is a tree, and the other one's holding onto a trunk. It's that old cliche. Integral becomes the process by which each of those blind men can actually share sort of their piece of the territory, and then we can put that all together into the image of an elephant. So this is where, integral, another word for integral philosophy is integral methodological pluralism, which basically says, here are all these different ways that we have of making sense of reality, and none of these methods can be easily reduced to the other. You can't reduce, all of the work coming out of the field of psychology to quantum theory and physics, for example. These are two different domains. We want to find ways to integrate both domains, but without saying, we want to keep them in their lanes, basically. So quantum physicists, you guys are doing a great job. Stay with quantum physics. Stop trying to make claims about consciousness and spirituality and all of that. And the same for you guys, you mystics over there who are on a meditation cushion all day. Stop making claims and trying to push them down into the quantum fabric of the universe. It just doesn't really work that way. So I think integral becomes the process by which we identify multiple truth claims and begin to weave them together into a more let's just say a meta truth, a sort of a meta methodological view that gives us a better sense of the overall elephant. And we begin to understand a little bit more clearly how all of these different sciences and all of these different avenues of generating knowledge, it all actually fits together and hangs together in a very cohesive way. And that tells us something, I think, very interesting about our universe. It tells us that our universe is hanging together in a very cohesive and coherent and understandable and meaningful even way. So that's one approach at your question. Is that satisfying to you?
Yeah, I think so. It's really cool seeing some of this stuff like come together. As theoretical physicists and cosmologists and stuff study the universe, we're coming to see that more and more of what we thought to be orange true just ain't so.
Yeah.
With black holes and gravity and that sort of thing. And on the other hand, we're coming to new understandings of things like gender, for instance. Like my personal experience of my gender, regardless of what my genitalia say, is really it's as important to me as, what my genitalia are.
Right.
And to like a doctor who needs to test my prostate for cancer, that's one thing. But if I experience life as a man or a woman or non-binary or whatever, that's completely different from whether or not I have a prostate to test.
Right.
And I think that, being that gender is such a hot button issue right now,
Yeah.
that's sort of where my brain goes when I think about all this stuff. I think Orange probably sacrifices epistemology for ontology. Their epistemology is just whatever is, whereas Green sacrifices ontology for epistemology. Whatever is doesn't matter because it's just what I know.
That's right.
So integrating those things
Well
is very important.
Well, and if we can, talk about your genitals for a little bit longer here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. It's my favorite topic. So,
well, it's another one of those areas where I feel like Integral offers just an enormous amount of liberation, right? In a fairly small package. Well, like not talking about your genitals there, of course. But the idea, and I know you talked to Bryan about the idea of quadrants, for example, the idea that we all have 4 basic irreducible dimensions to our experience. We have an upper left quadrant, which looks like consciousness. It's the interior of the individual. We have the exterior of the individual, which is your body, your phenotype, etc. We have the interior of the collective, which looks like culture. And then we have the exterior of the collective, which looks like systems, for example. Now, this becomes, I think, really germane to the gender conversation because right away, it suggests not sort of this single gender to rule them all, but it actually shows that we have at least these 4 fairly independent dimensions to our gender. So there's my genitals, right? Then there's my actual, my sexual orientation. Who am I actually attracted to? Regardless of my genitals, who am I attracted to? What is my sexual polarity? We know that some people tend to be more on the masculine side. Some people tend to be more on the feminine side. You have plenty of feminine men and you have plenty of masculine women. So it's not a one-to-one relationship between these. And then you look into the cultural sphere and you say, okay, there's all these gender roles that are available to us, all of which are socially constructed, and therefore we kind of can do whatever we want with them. And it's sort of exciting to see how every new generation defines their gender roles in very, very different ways. But even that doesn't happen in a vacuum. That also happens alongside, sort of the lower right quadrant, like what level of technology, for example, are you living in? Gender, we experience gender differently in a social media dominated universe than we do, than we did 100 years ago, for example, because sort of these different economic and social pressures create different, advantages and disadvantages to different gender roles, for example. 100 years ago, it was very hard to be a masculine woman who prefers a sort of a more male-ish kind of gender role in culture. That was almost impossible to achieve, but now it's like you kind of can. This is sort of what I've begun calling sort of an intersectionality of perspective, which is a lot more interesting to me than what we're seeing on the left right now, which is an intersectionality of identity.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I'd like to get into, for the last few minutes anyway, into the more personal stuff, because like I said at the beginning, it's much easier for me to look at society and criticize it than it is for me to like do my own shadow work, which to me, like once you've kind of gotten a handle of what this stuff is, actually practicing it is even more important.
Mm-hmm. Can I give a real quick caution there?
Yeah,
because I hear, but I want to give just a very quick caution. It's a good idea generally, if you feel like you have the capacity to see if you can track simultaneously, only because if you do have a shadow issue somewhere, that will distort your perception of what you see in the world.
Yeah, I know. Right? Like, absolutely. It's I like you were saying earlier, you use the trigger word. I find myself triggered all the time, like just mostly politically. Although right now, we live in a culture where culture and politics and, just even your normal, like what you read and eat are kind of overlapping. Curtis Yarvin, formerly known as Mencius Moldbug, a kind of right-wing writer anyway, he says that we live in a total state where everything is authoritarian and political, and you either can go with that or or die, basically, or be shunned. But it should be shunned, I guess, is better than die. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Trying to kind of marry those two. It's just I think for me and for a lot of people who kind of inhabit my sort of headspace, I don't know what my Enneagram is, which I'm sure we'll talk about for a second, but like my Myers-Briggs is ENTP, and that NT, that intuitive thinking, like direction, I guess, is where me and all of my confreres kind of go. We don't feel very well. We don't look inward very well. We think and we project. So learning how to do that, like growing that muscle of introspection, of shadow work, of even just like meditation and things like that is definitely going to be tougher for me and for probably a lot of my audience.
Totally.
So I'd love to just get like pointers, I guess, maybe like how do you start on that kind of thing?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a great question. And, I'll sort of preempt that by saying, we're talking about sort of some of these different typing systems that are out there. You just mentioned Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
We can also talk about the Enneagram, sort of a homebrew typing mechanism that we sometimes use just to kind of communicate a ton of information in a very short amount of time is actually using the 4 quadrants. Some people are sort of, they natively orient to the upper left quadrant. So these are people like myself. I've got a very rich inner life. I always have, right? That part has always come a little bit more easily to me. It's actually in the lower left where I've had a lot of my challenges, really sort of connecting with people and getting over some of my own anxieties and social anxieties and all that. That's a lot of that is sort of in the lower left. I also tend to be somewhat disorganized in the lower right, but that's just part of my creative process. So I can, I call myself an artist because it allows me to get away with the most stuff and, be sloppy. So, you on the other hand might be, and I'm not going to project this onto you, but you might be someone who primarily orients from the lower right quadrant. Like, no, I need to know sort of how all this stuff fits together before I can embrace it enough to even take a practice suggestion even remotely seriously, because it's like, I need to know you've got rigor here and you've got some actual sort of academic legitimacy, because why else would I trust you? Why else would I take that seriously? Other people might be coming from a lower left and they're starting purely from a relational point of view. I also know a lot of people who are upper right orienters, and they're very sort of action item driven, and they're very good at making checklists and checking those boxes and kind of going right through. So integral can look very, very different depending on which of these, sort of types you might be coming from. And the really cool thing is, I think we do a pretty good job of making room for all of it. There's some people who want to come in based purely on sort of the theory or looking out into the world and seeing how we can make sense of that whole clusterfuck. Other people are coming, at this with their own interior clusterfuck that they want to make sense of before they can even begin to understand what's going on out there. And again, this is the cool thing about integrals. We really do make space for all of this. Now, to actually answer your question, how do you begin sort of making those transitions? The best advice I can give people, well, I've got 2 pieces of advice. One from Ken Wilber himself and one from another one of my favorite teachers, Diane Musho Hamilton. Ken's advice is always start small. Like really small, like smaller than you think would even be worth doing.
Dude, I downloaded this meditation app that I thought was smart, starting small. And every morning at 8:30, my calendar without fail tells me, hey, go do that meditation app. And I don't do it. So I need to get even smaller than that. So let's,
even smaller.
that's great advice.
Yep. Well, Ken, what Ken says is like, okay, so you need a commitment. The commitment is important here. So, but make that commitment as gentle as possible. So Ken will say, start literally with 1 minute a day. Just scrape out one single minute to just sit and rest and to look at your own mind. Once you feel like you're doing that, right? Once you feel like, okay, 1 minute, that's been easy. I've been, I can knock that out of the park. Expand it to 2 minutes, expand it to 3, expand it to 4. Just keep gently pushing it forward. Now, some people might find, if I sit longer than 5 minutes, I get restless and I find myself, it's harder to get much further than that. In which case, Lama Surya Das's advice would be, that's fine. Instead of meditating, feeling like you need to get to the point where you're sitting for an hour every day, have multiple sort of, punctuated meditations throughout the day. So do a minute in the morning, do a minute in the afternoon, do a minute in the evening, and see if that helps. And I think that the basic idea is once you begin to feel some of the benefit, it's like working out. No one wants to do it until they actually start feeling the benefits of it, right? But it takes a little bit of commitment and a little bit of patience and a little bit of energy in order to begin feeling those benefits that naturally then make you want to work out more. This is my challenge. I don't work out nearly enough. So I'm trying to take my own medicine here. But it's the same is true with meditation. You don't want to commit to something too big because you'll just, you'll burn your own fuse. What'll happen is you'll end up being disappointed with yourself because you couldn't keep your commitment. That's going to make you resent the process altogether. It's going to make you less likely to try again later. No. Strip it down, man. Bring it down to just that single minute, because who doesn't have a minute to spare? And I think what we find is that the more you do that, the more you just kind of spontaneously find yourself doing it anyway. It's like, oh, I'm waiting at a traffic light for the, for the lights to change. Oh, I just realized I've been sort of looking at my mind for a minute. That's, I think, the level of granularity that, people need to find in order to get into this stuff. The other piece is find a community, right? So one of the things that we're doing on integrallife.com is we've actually created a new platform. If you can allow me to sort of hawk my wares.
Yeah, totally.
We have a new platform for something we call Integral Life Practice. And so what we're doing there is we're actually creating little live sessions where people can go and touch in with a group of people and do any number of practices together. And there's something about sitting with each other that both seems to strengthen the commitment for one, but also creates more rewarding and more enriching experiences for people. It sort of feels like here's this little kind of hole in the universe where I can just sort of do my thing for, however long the practice is. Sometimes it's a half an hour. And we do, multiple practices every day, and they're all live and they're all guided by a practice teacher. That's another way to do it. I mean, just to kind of put your toe in the water, be like, oh, I'm going to try this growing up practice, or I'm going to try this cleaning up practice just to see how it tastes, right? If it tastes good, you'll probably be back for more. If it tastes bad, you'll try something else.
I love that.
So that's a resource that we try to make available to people.
I ask all of my guests for like a bit of advice. And the find a community piece of advice is what every single person has said so far. For you, it was an integral community. For, my agorist guests, which for your own edification, agorism is sort of a more radical version of libertarianism. It's, find a community to engage in black market activity with, that kind of thing. It's just nuts how that is the biggest piece of advice that everyone across, all different realms are giving right now.
We are a bunch of primates after all.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And it doesn't necessarily mean be tribal. It's just, find a tribe and coexist with the other tribes too. Yep. Like that's important too.
Yes. Yep. The nice thing about the integral tribe is that it is sort of intrinsically a multi-perspectival tribe. The problem that a lot of tribalism falls into is it becomes mono-perspectival, right? These are the views and the values of the tribe, and don't you dare transgress. Integral is itself, it self-identifies as multi-perspectivalism, which means we invite any and all perspectives to play. Now, we might not, here's where I think the challenge people run into. A lot of people come into the integral community expecting their perspective to be primary. And then they sort of, oh, wait, you're placing me. You're, I like to say freeing by limiting, right? You're not making me primary anymore. You're just saying I'm just one node among all these other nodes. And it's like, yes, that is multi-perspectivalism in action right there. So yeah, finding community is always key because we are just a bunch of apes. And this is, this has been our central survival strategy for, how many millions of years now?
Forever and ever, as far back as we can go. Is there a lot of infighting in integral communities?
Infighting?
Yeah, like arguing amongst each other.
Oh, constant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally relatable.
Part of which I think is, I always invite healthy dissonance. I myself, I find myself more attracted to having conversations with people who, we might share some fundamental agreements on, but there might be some surface level disagreements. Like I would love to have a conversation with you about the insurrection, for example, and just us, coming in good faith and saying, I've got a different perspective than you do. Can we find ways to kind of fit these together, right? I love those kinds of conversations. Now, the thing of it is again, integral, this is one of our biggest challenges, is that integral is itself a postmodern stage of development, right? And yet it is unfolding. It is unfolding on these 100% postmodern platforms like Facebook.
Yeah.
And the problem with these platforms is they are not conducive to integral, we call enfoldment, to integral sort of the ability to really come together in a good faith and embodied way. Social media is just terrible at this, right? I mean, that's why I'm glad, I know you're going to release this as an audio, but I'm so glad I get to see you as I'm talking to you, because even this brings so much of that embodiment back into the conversation. I can, if I say a joke, I can tell if it's just a total stinker if you don't react, or, if you laugh, it makes me feel good. And then that, there's feedback loops when you have a conversation like this. When everything is just text only, as it tends to be in social media, you lose all of that. You lose your good faith. And honestly, you lose your capacity to discern which people are more or less qualified, right, in order to, present the perspective that they're presenting. So there's a lot of people who self-identify as integral who still haven't necessarily done the work. Who we would say, yeah, you're onto something, but you got some growing up to do. You got some waking up to do. You certainly got some cleaning up to do, right? And that's okay, because this is an ongoing process. That's the thing we have to remember, is that integral is not a destination. It's something that we are doing, that we are engaging in every single day. So I invite dissonance. Sometimes it gets a little bit raucous. I moderate these groups, and I try to moderate them with a very, very light touch. I don't do a lot of banning people for stinking thinking or anything like that. But I do ban people for just getting abusive. And that does happen sometimes, because people, get carried away with their identities and with their sense of self. Another metaphor just to bring in here, because I get back to the wake up, grow up, clean up, show up here, because I think it's helpful to keep in mind when we see how different communities come together, is that, classically, often in spiritual circles, a lot of people come to integral, do so from spiritual communities. And those spiritual communities often frame the relationship of like spirituality and ego as like naturally hostile to each other, right? Like if you have an ego, you can't be spiritual. If you're spiritual, you can't have an ego. Integral kind of does this a little bit differently. So, my shorthand here is that the process of growing up is actually the process of making your ego bigger and bigger at each stage. Ken Wilber, for example, has one of the biggest egos of anyone you've ever met. And I don't mean, I mean that in 100% healthy way. He's got a big, beautiful ego, right? Because alongside that growing up process that makes your ego bigger and bigger, the waking up process makes that ego more and more transparent. You can see through it. You tone down the opacity levels of your own ego, which means you don't have to take yourself so goddamn seriously all the time. That's what the waking up path offers to us. Cleaning up, on the other hand, is about taking, sort of all of this unseen stuff that's, sort of behind you, behind your mind's eye, bringing it to the surface so that you can bring it into awareness. So now your big, beautiful ego is a big, beautiful integrated ego that you can see through, right? It's got some translucency or transparency to it. And then the showing up is actually you using that ego in the world in order to produce generative effects and to reduce suffering in people's lives. I mean, that's the real reason we're here, right? Is to reduce suffering however and whenever we can for whoever we can. And you need an ego in order to do that. You need a self. You need this, this operating system in order to produce goodness and beauty and truth in the world. So that's why we have an ego. So Integral says, embrace your ego, but make it as big, as healthy, as transparent as you possibly can, so that it may be to the benefit of all beings.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great kind of place to close it out.
Sure.
And so I appreciate your time. Why don't you go ahead and, plug your work? Where can people find you?
Yeah. So a few things. So if you want to find out more about Integral itself, I totally invite you to go to integrallife.com. We have a ton of free resources there. We're actually this is a little bit exciting. We're about to release a brand new web course, which will be completely free to everybody, which is teaching sort of the integral basics. And it includes, last time I counted, it's something like 30 hours of free content in there. So just these endless rabbit holes that you can jump down in order to understand more about the integral approach. That's something that we're going to be releasing very, very soon on integrallife.com. I invite everyone who's listening to this right now to check that out. Again, it's totally free. There's no obnoxious infomercials in there or anything like that. If you go to integrallife.com, you'll also find our practice platform. You can take a look at that. And then, the other thing I just want to mention is I'm also a woodworker. And I run a business called Vision Logics Woodworks, where I make all sorts of things for people. So I make a lot of like integral iconography. I do Enneagram designs, for example, which was something that maybe we'll talk about next time we get together. So that's something I'm working on right now. You can actually find out more about that on my Vision Logics Woodworks Facebook page. So you can just Google Vision Logics with an X. It'll probably bring it to my Woodworks page, and I would love for everyone to check out my art.
I will make sure to link to both of those things as well. And I really appreciate your time today, Corey, and I do look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks again to Corey for joining me today. I know this is jam-packed with information, so I'll make sure to put helpful links in the show notes to articles and books and things like that you can read, podcasts you can listen to for more information on integral theory. Like I said, I am just now learning this, so I really appreciate any dialogue that you would like to start as well. Feel free to message me in private on Twitter or email me via the Substack messages that you get. Speaking of Substack, please make sure that you're subscribed there. That is the best place to get this podcast along with any written content that I publish. But wherever you get the podcast, just hit that subscribe button. Make sure you're leaving ratings and reviews, thumbs up, that sort of thing. And I appreciate you once again for listening. And until the next episode, live free.